Hello, I'm Dan Gibson, and this is another video in this series, The Qibla Story. So far, we have traced the development of the Qibla from the beginning of Islam through the city of Petra, then Mecca, then the between Qiblas, the parallel Qiblas, and in the last video we looked at the crumbling of the Umayyad Caliphate and the shame that was attached to this period of time. The Abbasids brought about a new day for Islam. First, Abu Abbas al-Safa arranged for the killing of all of the remaining Umayyads. In the end, no one escaped except Abdurrahman ibn al-Mawiyah. He escaped to Spain, where the Umayyads would continue to rule for another 300 years. Back in the Middle East, Abbas al-Safa made the city of Kufa his new capital city, and he went about putting down rebellions and solidifying the military might of the Abbasid army. A couple of years later, he died of smallpox. The next caliph was al-Mansur, who was also of Muhammad's family, and like Abu Abbas was also from the small town of Humayma near Petra. In the same year, it's 145 after the Hijrah, al-Mansur built a new capital city, known as Medinat as-Salam, or the City of Peace. That city became the core of what is known today as Baghdad. Now, al-Mansur had a problem. His brother, Abu Abbas, had tried to solidify the Islamic Empire through military might. He had had some success, and so al-Mansur continued to use force, but he needed something more. So al-Mansur came up with additional solutions. These solutions focused on image. Up until this time, Islam appeared to many outsiders as a bloody religion. There was lots of killing and beheading and forcing people to pay a special tax if they were non-Muslims. Al-Mansur needed to change the image of Islam, and so he began with his new City of Peace. This was a city that focused on arts, on science, on education, as well as on housing the growing number of bureaucrats in the empire. That the empire needed these bureaucrats because they were now from North Africa to Central Asia. Perhaps the arts, science, and education were only started to serve the bureaucrats. I don't know. Whatever the reason, the government started investing in the founding of institutions, and they began sponsoring individuals that would serve the purpose of providing a new image for Islam. One of the first things al-Mansur did was establish a library. His main problem was that books and scrolls were available in other languages, but not so much in Arabic, the language of the Muslim court. So al-Mansur brought groups of Syriac-speaking Christians to Baghdad to translate books from Syriac and Greek. He also incorporated a Persian library and ordered the transcription of many science and philosophy books written in Persian to be translated into Arabic. The availability of these new resources began to attract scholars, hopeful for court sponsorship. That means money to live by. And eventually, various new scholars arrived, and these new schools developed around these new scholars. Al-Mansur was the second Abbasid Caliph. 11 years after he died, Harun al-Rashid founded the famous House of Wisdom as a library for the collections of translated books and works. Over the years, many famous academics were attracted to the city. Now, 500 years later, just a note, in 1258, the Mongols invaded from Baghdad. They burned the House of Wisdom. They threw the ashes and what was left into the Tigris River, bringing an end to the Islamic Golden Age. What is of interest to us is, in this series of videos, is how this affected the Qibla of Islam. Remember, under the Umayyads, there were at least 5 different Qiblas. When the City of Peace was constructed, a mosque was placed in the very center, with its Qibla wall fashioned so that the faithful faced Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Then the circular city was constructed around that great mosque. There was no question of the Qibla direction. All mosques built by the Abbasids faced Mecca in Saudi Arabia. But there was still a question: were there better ways to determine the Qibla direction? The gathering of scholars into one city, with a focus on a central library and a number of new schools around it, brought a revolution in academia. Up until this time, scholars would study and write papers in their far-flung corners of the earth, and it took many years before their writings circulated and eventually were translated into other languages. Sometimes we failed to appreciate the time that this would take. Often, a scholar was long dead before his ideas were known to other scholars. This persisted up until the 1700s, when the first peer-reviewed journals began to appear. So the exchange of research information was long, it was slow, it was tedious. But the House of Wisdom and the atmosphere in Baghdad changed all of that. Suddenly, great scholars were in the same city. They had access to the same great libraries. They could even interact with one another. This created academic synergy and a burst of academic achievements only occasionally seen in history. In Baghdad, this time of academic achievement blossomed over several hundred years. Right from its inception, however, the state sponsored and there was government control. It was evident in the whole thing. The new Islamic State in Baghdad was concerned that the religion of Islam and their rule was always reflected in good light. So while new innovations in science and mathematics and astronomy were greatly encouraged, innovation was not encouraged in religion and history. During this time, a number of noted historians were sponsored by political figures or the government in general. Now, this is not a new thing. Even the great Roman historian Strabo was sponsored by high-ranking Roman officials. He stayed for extended times in the home of a Roman general while compiling his glorious history of Rome. Was he influenced by his sponsors? You can be sure. In this case, the Muslim chroniclers of history, one thing was certain: their histories would never negatively reflect on the religion of Islam or the character of the Prophet or the right of the Abbasids to rule. So while they could speak derogatorily about the evils of the previous Umayyad rulers, they could not reflect badly on Islam as a religion. This bias is reflected in all of the histories written under the Abbasids, and they ruled for many centuries. Another interesting observation we can make is that there was a particular interest at this time among mathematicians in the discovering of better ways to calculate the Qibla direction. I have gone through a list of famous academics of this period, and I've made a shorter list, you can see it here on the screen, of those who were particularly interested in math, astronomy, and Qibla studies. Each of these scholars added another piece of the puzzle. Here's the list from the earliest to later. The dates are listed when the scholars died, or at least when they were at the height of their writing, which was usually later in life. Now, for several decades, one of the world's experts on this time period was Dr. David A. King, who has written a host of papers on this time period and on the works of a number of these medieval scholars who were instrumental in Qibla studies. Dr. King has disagreed with me on my conclusions about the 5 different Qibla directions in early Islam, so I feel I must address his proposals when talking about the medieval mathematicians. One of the earlier publications of Dr. King's about the Qibla was done as a joint paper with the famous astronomer Dr. Gerald Hawkins, who made a startling conclusion in his 1965 book on Stonehenge. But he was not the first. He used the ideas put forward by Dr. Alexander Thom in his series of papers published on Stonehenge. Dr. Thom and later Gerald Hawkins claimed that Stonehenge was an astronomical observatory to predict the movement of the sun and the stars. At the time, they were very poorly received by the academic world. But his book quickly caught on among conspiracy theorists and New Age folk and so forth, and it grew in popularity. That was the beginning of the popularization of this new science, archaeoastronomy. Then, almost 20 years later, Dr. King produced an academic paper on the Qibla with the same famous Dr. Gerald Hawkins of Stonehenge. Dr. King's theory was based on the orientation of the Kaaba building itself. Just as in Stonehenge, these men measured the Kaaba building and looked for any corresponding relationship to the stars. In a 1982 paper jointly written by King and Hawkins that we've talked about, they produced this chart based on what correlations they could find between the Kaaba building and the stars in the sky. In the same paper, they also produced another chart. Notice that no specific degrees are given. It's all in generalizations, as they concluded that the Arabs of that time could only determine direction in generalities. From this chart, one might think that the Kaaba building had amazing alignments. In the end, some years later, Dr. King settled on this chart to explain the Kaaba orientation. And now we're a little closer to the truth. Now, don't be fooled by the Arabic words. Shami is simply means north, and Dabur means it can mean west, although it's not anywhere near west, but I guess that's close enough to west rather than to south. So how sure was Dr. Gerald Hawkins about the accuracy of this whole project? He is one of the authors of this paper. Dr. King is presenting most of the data. Now here is how Dr. Hawkins ends the paper. From the point of view of an astronomer, the medieval text references are not exact or specific, though there are general references to the rising of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Another quote. There are inconsistencies wherein the medieval writer has apparently inverted rising and setting, and there are ambiguities such as what does opposite the western corner mean? Nor are the astronomical dates clearly established. The one text cited was written about 1290 AD, but the original Kaaba was constructed over 1,000 years earlier. Notice what Dr. Hawkins is saying. Many of the medieval writers are hundreds of years earlier. After his comments about how tenable the data is, Dr. Hawkins states, here's another quote, however, for the information of historical scholars, measurements have been obtained and astronomical calculations made. Now, what does he mean by this? I'll let you guess, but it sounds like we mere historical scholars should be satisfied with the general calculations. Then Dr. Hawkins discusses their sources. This is where they got the information. The altitude of the skyline surrounding the Kaaba was obtained from the map published by the municipality of Mecca in 1967, and the walls and the diagonals of the Kaaba were also read off the map. I'm sorry, we don't have a copy of that map, and I haven't been able to find a copy. So I cannot tell you if it was intended for scientific use or if it was merely a tourist map. Dr. Hawkins goes on. The alignment to the sun, as referenced to in the scripts, are accurate to no better than 5 or 10 degrees. What? They couldn't get a reading on the sun better than 5 or 10 degrees? I doubt the map was very accurate, but let's listen to Dr. Hawkins. He says, the alignment to the stars of the plough seems to be more relevant to the medieval period than to the time of the laying of the foundation of the Kaaba. Interesting. So the measurements which he has published here, are no longer mentioned by Dr. King in his papers. You see, 5 years later, Dr. King was publishing papers with his own name on them, and the cautionary tone set by Dr. Hawkins is no longer there. Instead, Dr. King now writes with assuredness. For instance, in his 1987 article in the Encyclopedia of Islam, Mecca is the center of the world, it contains none of the original cautionary comments of Dr. Hawkins. Eventually, Dr. King seems to be taking the medieval writers seriously, believing that they were telling us how things were actually done centuries before their time. His articles have no hint that al-Biruni and others were merely making suggestions or offering possible solutions. Suddenly, they were telling us accurately and with assurance how the Qibla was established before the science of mathematics provided methods of being much more accurate. That's why they have these wild Qiblas pointing in different directions. It is here that I have trouble with Dr. King. It's the tone of his research and not the actual research itself. As I see it, al-Biruni and others were merely trying to explain how the early Qiblas were set. They were doing their best, but they did not have the information we have today. They had only access to the towns they lived in and maybe places they had visited or heard about. Now, we're going to end in just a few moments, but I want us to think carefully about what we can learn about the Kaaba in Mecca. You see, the scientific data that we have collected, and it's all freely available on the internet, the form of the Qibla tool, and that demonstrates to us that the first Qibla pointed towards Petra in Jordan. I've listed over 20 mosques that faced Petra, that we can gather information where it seems to face Petra. The other mosques that remain from that period of time, they've all been destroyed and rebuilt, so we can no longer examine the foundation and know where they pointed to. So we have not found a single mosque from that time period that points to any other place except to Petra. When we go to Petra, we can find the foundations of the original Kaaba. It's there. This edifice fits the measurements given to us by al-Azraqi. Al-Azraqi was writing about the Kaaba that stood during Muhammad's lifetime. The Kaaba stands in the corner of a courtyard, just like in the earlier accounts that are described. He writes that the wall around the courtyard contained the Hatam, that's a bulge out in the wall, which seems to have gone around the grave of Ishmael. Later, that wall was joined to the Kaaba building, and we can see that in Mecca. Later, the Kaaba was centered in the middle of a great large court area, and we can see that in the Kaaba in Mecca, and we can trace which caliphs made these changes. So what about the Kaaba in Mecca? What can we learn from its shape and its direction? First, it is a different size from the original Kaaba in Mecca. I don't think that the shape of the walls or the angles of the buildings demonstrate anything. But there is one thing we can tell. When the Hatam wall was attached to the Kaaba building, it gave the Kaaba in Mecca direction. The Hatam provides a face for the Kaaba. And where does it face? Just follow the direction north until it reaches the first Kaaba in Petra. That's what it's trying to tell us. The Kaaba in Mecca is trying to tell us it's not about the stars or the angles or the sun or the moon. This is not Stonehenge. The Kaaba building itself in Mecca faces the original Kaaba building in Petra. Now, there is a second issue here, and I want to address this, for we will close with this. From ancient times, the corners of the Kaaba building have had names. Here are the names. There's the Iraqi corner, the Yemeni corner, the Shami corner, and the Black Stone corner. Now let's place a large drawing of the Mecca Kaaba onto a map. How much sense do the corner names make? What if you tried to rearrange the names? Could you make more sense out of them? Could you put the Shami, which means north or up towards Damascus, Shami is Damascus, if you put that in the north, then the Iraqi corner would have to point east. And the names of the Kaaba corners, they don't make any sense in Saudi Arabia. And several people have written me and asked me about this. You can't even rearrange them to make sense. Now, what about in Petra? That is the Mecca that was in Jordan. Look here, the names actually point in the correct direction. They make sense. Friends, without understanding the importance of the first city of Mecca, which was in Petra, the first Kaaba was there, the alignment of the Kaaba building and the names of the four corners are hard to explain. But once we grasp that the original Kaaba building was in Petra, it's much easier to understand the Kaaba building in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another video in the series, The Qibla Story.